Hey guys, how's it going? Kripparrian here. I have for you guys another build guide for Path of Exile, and this one is featuring a Lich-based summoner. So you're seeing footage from my very first tier 15 map. I did try to get this character off the ground as soon as I could, and it is a very potent summoner that utilizes a combination of passive and active minions. Now, a lot of people ask what the best ascendancy for minions is. Now, you'll be able to respec it soon enough, so you can kind of stick with whatever you rolled. In my opinion, Infernalist does a lot better with passive minions because you can get a larger spirit pool and more damage if you manage your Infernal Flame. And Lich gets off the ground a little bit faster. It's easier to get like a little bit of chaos damage from the ascendancy first. Go a little further. And Lich does better for utilizing mana, and late game it allows you to scale spell-based minions with Sigil of Power. I think the Frost Mage is the ideal minion to do this, and I think the build came out really well. If you guys do want to check out the build, it is going to be on Mobalytics. The written form will be linked below for you guys, so you guys can go back and check each of the gems that I have, the details with the specters, and the passives if you wish. So the build does work pretty well. Just keep in mind this is the first T15 map that I did. Didn't die, didn't really come close to dying. It's a very safe build. If you're wondering, this was what the boss looked like. It was not much of a boss. Again, this is a T15 boss. It has, I think, extra damage, speed, and area, but it doesn't really matter. Oh, and this is actually the highest HP boss in the game, I believe, if the campaign numbers are anything to go by anyway. So he gets shocked, debuffed like crazy, and frozen, and then he's dead. That's the fight. Yeah, there it is. So pretty good build. How about that? So how does it work? We are in game. So in terms of the Lich ascendancies, there are some very important interactions here. So Necromantic Conduit, you lose 5% mana per second. The base mana regen is 4. And while you're not on low mana, which is 1/3 mana, you can check with that, a little over, you and allies in your presence have Unholy Might, which is 30 damage as extra chaos. And this is obviously really hard to maintain unless you have lots of mana regen, so the best thing to do is just to go Soulless Form. This combined with the other is excellent as long as you have a small mana pool and a large health pool, at least comparably. So 2,000 health, 700 mana means that instead of 4% of my mana regenerating, I get 6% of my health, and my health is like triple, so it's kind of like almost 5 times your base mana regen. It's just a crazy amount of mana regen, and it allows you to do a few things. It allows you to use spells that are really high casting costs, so you can just spam the button for the cold mages. You can do Frost Bomb, you can do Pain Offering, your mana just goes all the way back up. This is a absolute max level hypothermia. Look at my mana drop, but then you just get it all back over again. This is really important, and the end game scaling has to do with weapon swap. If you get a Chiming Staff with Sigil of Power creates a rune on the ground, and it has stages. You weapon swap back, and when you spend mana, it gains a stage when you spend 50% of your mana pool. Now, because the mana regen is based on the health and the mana pool is relatively small, it's super easy to get 4 stages, which gives you a massive area boost to spell damage. And most of the damage that we're doing comes from the Frost Mages, so it actually is utilized very well. This is largely why Lich succeeds with minions. It's largely because of the combination of these two ascendancy passives. I really like the Jewel one. If you get a really good Jewel, this is the best Jewel I've ever had in Path of Exile 2. I do play solo Self-Found, so it helps. Lastly, I would get Blackened Heart. A lot of people would say to go Eternal Life. You can try it if you want. I think I am not going to do Eternal Life. I'll explain why in a moment. Blackened Heart will basically give you, even if you have like 1,000 mana, you'll get 40% increased effect, which is 12% more all damage as extra chaos damage. Just a little bit more damage, probably about 10% more damage overall. And increased mana is kind of bad, but whatever. Eternal Life, your life cannot be changed while you have Energy Shield. This has a lot of downsides. If you take a bunch of damage and you're at like 10 life and your energy starts regenerating, your potion will not work. That sucks, in my opinion. It'll create gameplay that'll be very tedious for a build like this one. It does give you damage reduction because damage that would otherwise bypass Energy Shield is ignored, which is really cool. But the downsides are definitely there. Another downside is that your Pain Offering, which sacrifices a minion, I typically always use Ablation, which gives it 30% increased buff effect, which is a lot of extra damage. You have to use 15% life on use, so this will not work. You will not be able to use this support gem. So there's a lot of give for that passive, and that's why I don't recommend it, but you know, it's your characters. You guys can give it a try. I think some people might end up on it. So the base damage comes from the Skeletal Frost Mage. It has very high base damage on its Ice Shard, and there's lots of different builds that you'll see with Skeletal Frost Mage. I use Skeletal Frost Mage as a one-of just by spamming its command in the Infernalist minion army build. You guys can check out that build in my profile and Mobalytics as well if you wish. Now, when you do that, you sacrifice its auto attack entirely, okay? Because you use the 100% cooldown reduction of the ability. Now, the ability, which drops like a frost nuke, this is really, really high damage. It's tooltipping at 28,000 here. I still have to respec a little bit. It'll probably get it into the 50,000 range, I imagine, with actually really good endgame gear. So it's just really strong. It's just a ton of damage, and the button has 100%, I believe, magnitude of chill. So this will result in more things being chilled and frozen. Just slowing it down, you saw I was freezing literally endgame bosses almost instantaneously, so it's very easy to do that. A lot of builds that use Frost Mages, they either go all in on its command or they go all in on its auto attacks. So there are trade-offs to both of these. If you go all in on the command like I did in my other build, your auto attacks don't even deal damage. If you go all in on your auto attacks, you're going to want to use like Scattershot, and Scattershot has a massive penalty. Your command will be reduced by about 50%. So that is massive. My strategy with this build is to utilize the Frost Mage in its entirety, and we're using supports that scale both its auto attack and its cooldown. So Arcane Tempo, skills have 20% more cast speed. Now this affects their own auto attack, but it also affects the cast time of their use ability. Now their use ability doesn't have any cooldown reduction associated with it, but each cooldown is based on each individual Frost Mage, and with 5 Frost Mages I literally never need to like wait for a cooldown when I use that ability, especially because I use some of the other abilities as well. Muster is an amazing new support gem. So supported minions deal 7% more damage for each different type of persistent minions you have summoned. So we're using Frost Mages, the Clerics, 1 Reaver, a Spectre, and the Storm Mage. So we're getting 35% more damage, and this applies to both the use and the auto. Feeding Frenzy is 30, and Embiter is an interesting one. So if supported skills would gain extra damage of any other type, they gain extra cold damage instead. So that largely has to do with Unholy Might and any other kind of residual damage you might have extra. So gaining 30% of their damage as Chaos it can be good, but if instead it gets it as cold, we can further debuff it because we're using a cold curse and we're using frost bomb for a massive exposure reduction. So cold damage is far more valuable. It ends up being far more damage. I can't tell you exactly how much damage this is, but this absolutely is a very good support gem for this setup, especially if we get the 4th Ascendancy point to scale the value of our Unholy Might from our mana pool. The other thing that it does is cold damage instead of chaos will, even though it might be the same number, it'll allow you to have a larger chill or freeze, because instead of part of your damage being cold, now all of your damage is cold. And you guys saw the defensive aspects of this build are very strong. When you freeze bosses, you're freezing everything. We have the curse, we have the frost bomb. Frost bomb is just a way to use exposure. It's quite strong because it's sourced from the player, so you're able to scale it with the passive tree. The clerics are just there to res and heal and keep your minions up. You always want at least 2. 3 is fine. Reaver is the sacrificial Reaver, so he is always going to get targeted when you use Pain Offering, and Death March will cleanse your other minions and heal them. So if I use this, it'll always target the Reaver. There's no RNG there, and that is very nice because the Reaver doesn't do anything, and the cleanse from Death March is super valuable. We use a Spectre. There's 2 options for Spectre. You can use a Terracotta Soldier because it costs 10 Spirit, but I prefer the Vol Guard. It does a lot of damage. It does a grenade. The combination of Scattershot and Magnified Effect is very strong. The main issue with the Vol Guard is that the damage is very delayed, and the damage from your cold mages and your other minions in this build is actually really fast. So I think Execute is a really good support gem here. 50 more damaged enemies that are on low life. This ends up being about 17% more damage, but because all your other minions are attacking first, it ends up being actually an insane amount of damage. It's very good support. And I'm using Cold Infusion just because cold damage is more valuable than other damage types. You could probably use whatever there, it doesn't matter very much. The main reason why we use the Vol Guard is, yes, it just does really good damage. A Vol Guard does almost as much damage as 2 Frost Mages. So that's why they're pretty much interchangeable for damage, but their damage is slow. And they don't freeze, they don't have the command, but what they do have is a tiny amount of fire damage. But that tiny amount of fire damage seems to be sufficient to light the oil on the ground that they use from their grenades. So the stuff is always burning. And because it's burning, even though the burn is like negligible damage, our Storm Mage, which has extra chance to shock, Lightning Pen, also has shocks from supported skills do not expire on ignited enemies. So if you have the Vol Guard and you have a setup similar to this, it ignites its own oils, which is permanent ignite, which means that if the Storm Mage ever shocks a boss, and they shock the boss all the time, the shock will never expire, and the shock is effectively an extra damage multiplier. Now, this build does a lot better to shock than other minion builds because we are actually scaling crit. So we're going crit there, we're going crit there, and we're trying to get some kind of crit modifiers on the jewels if possible. And the reason we want to do that is because the Storm Mage has a pretty high crit chance, but the Frost Mage has a ridiculously high crit chance. The base crit chance of Frost Mage, I think, is 12 on the auto and 14 on the bomb. Yeah. So scaling crit is actually valuable if they are the main source of your damage, and because you're scaling crit, it makes sense to scale crit damage, and that means that the Storm Mage's arc will have a really high ceiling. See, 243 bonus damage on a crit. So if this crits, and it does 18% of the time, and it doesn't hit like minimal on the range, it will absolutely shock even the highest health bosses in the game. And then if it shocks it once, the Vol Guard's burning oil will keep the shock the entire time. Overall, this is just a very strong setup. It plays a lot more actively. You want to curse, you want to keep your frost bomb for the exposure, and you want to kind of lead with the frost mage, because it just, like, if it doesn't freeze or one-shot stuff, it's just going to chill it and slow it down so substantially. Because of those reasons, the build is a little bit different than some of my other summoners. I don't think you actually need the faster revives. These minions are just not really dying because your damage is really high and everything is chilled and frozen all the time. This allows you to put your points into more damage passives, and the next one that I was gunning for is this one. So this one, +1 level of cold skills, does actually work on your cold mages, and it does make sense to get glaciation, even though, like, these cold nodes, just to be clear, do not buff the damage of your cold mages. Cold damage does not work. You need minion damage, because you're the one applying the exposure through Frost Bomb. 25% more exposure is a sizable increase in damage, and 1 level on your cold mages is a sizable increase in damage as well. I really like the scale area. It affects a lot of other things. Just, you know, even though the frost bomb gets scaled, there's a lot of stuff that works with minion area. The Volguard is far more effective. The clear is far more effective. The button is far more effective. The pain offering is actually a minion, so the range that your minions are buffed from the pain offering buff is based on minion area. And that is also why I recommend to allocate long distance relationship, which is a really, really long distance one here. It's one of the few minion nodes on the passives tree outside of the area and likely reach of a typical witch build. 20% increased minion area, but also 30% increased presence area. So the Unholy Might extra damage is your presence. And you can, I believe you can check your presence. I think if you hover over something, you can check your presence. I forget how to do that now. But it's pretty big, but you want to keep it as big as you can, because you do still want to move around to dodge some attacks from the different monsters as they come at you. Overall, I've had a blast playing minions this league in PoE. It was a bit of a challenge in the first few days when the tuning of the game and minions just came at a clash that were pretty much unplayable. But now that I've played them, now that they've actually fixed a lot of the issues, minions are absolutely playable in endgame. And I hope at the very least the 2 builds I've put up for you guys in this season so far can get you started. Make sure to check out the build in the link below on Mobalytics, and we'll see you next time.